There were counties whose names rose to fame by armies, by capitals, or by the accident of loud events. Then there were counties whose substance lay in quieter accumulations, in fields measured one furrow at a time, in roads cut through timber without flourish, in flour bolted at dawn, and in hymn books opened by lamplight, and in the patient entry of names into ledgers that were never meant for poetry. Montgomery County belonged to this latter order. Its history had not been silent, for no country so watered and so traveled could be wholly silent. Yet its deepest record had often rested in common things. And common things were the first to vanish when memory hurried on. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to Montgomery County, Ohio, where the meadows about Dayton, the black bottoms of the riverlands, the beach tracts of the uplands, and the branching waters of the Miami country received generation after generation of laboring households. Here, the county was not merely bounded by survey and statute, but by habit, by church bells, by mill dams, by orchard rows, by schoolhouse benches, and by the little economies of winter and seed time. To enter such a place with proper calm was to move not in search of spectacle, but in search of continuance. Before the county wore its accustomed name, the valley had already possessed a character of its own. Travelers and settlers, approaching through the heavy timber and the long reaches of grass, saw not one scene, but several joined together with unusual grace. There were wooded ridges bearing oak, walnut, maple, and beech. There were moist openings where wild grasses bent in broad, pale swaths. There were river bottoms, dark and strong with promise. And there were swift waters whose course seemed at once generous and unruly. The great Miami River gave the region its principal line, and into it came the Mad River with its quicker motion, the Stillwater from the northwestern country, Wolf Creek from the west, Twin Creek lower down, and lesser runs that fed meadow or mill seat in their turn. The land had been described in period accounts as rolling, heavily wooded, and yet repeatedly opening upon rich levels, so that the eye moved from shade to brightness, and from enclosed forest to sudden breadth with a kind of measured astonishment. The earliest households who later claimed Montgomery County did not first inherit convenience, they inherited position, and position required interpretation. One tract stood high and dry, but needed patient clearing. Another, dark and fertile, yielded richly, yet demanded caution in flood season. A third, lying in beachland, might carry standing water in 1 month and a hopeful grain crop in another. Men later spoke of rich black bottoms, of second bottoms, of clay uplands fit for wheat or tobacco, and of northern stretches made serviceable only after persistent drainage and ditching. Such distinctions mattered more than rhetoric. Upon them depended where a cabin rose, where an orchard was attempted, where a lane could be kept passable in thaw, where swine might be turned, and where a child could be sent in winter without sinking to the ankle in mire. The very quietness of the county's later prosperity had been born of these early discriminations. The soil had to be read before it could be praised. When the county was created in 1803, out of divisions formerly attached to Hamilton and Ross, it received a name taken from General Richard Montgomery, whose death in the assault upon Quebec had already passed into the patriotic recollection of the Republic. Yet the land so named had not come into existence by naming. It had first entered formal settlement through the complicated enterprise of purchase, survey, and promise. Judge John Cleve Sims's Miami Purchase had brought great reaches of land between the Great and Little Miami rivers into speculation and expectation. Daniel C. Cooper, acting in that early stage, cut the road northward from Fort Hamilton along the east bank of the Miami, making possible not only the movement of men, but the imagining of towns before towns existed. Thus, geography became intention. A valley that had once been approached by trail and water began to be approached also by line and title, by deed and plat, by the steady confidence that a road through timber was itself a prophecy of households to come. The place where Dayton would arise had already recommended itself by meeting and confluence. Near the mouth of the Mad River, where waters and routes converged, there existed both hazard and promise in singular measure. Flood might come, fever might come, hard winter might come. But commerce, if it came at all, would come there also. The valley opened northward and westward. The river bounded southward. The surrounding country promised grain, timber, stock, and human increase. In these convergences lay the county's future manner. It would not become merely a farming interior, nor merely a towned thoroughfare, nor merely a river tract. It would be all three at once, and this union of meadow, market, and movement gave to Montgomery County that composed but active countenance which later observers recognized almost at a glance. So the county began not with a single dramatic act, but with a sequence of readings: the reading of water, the reading of timber, the reading of soils, the reading of distance. Those who came would add another reading still, namely the reading of one another's endurance. In later years, a township line might seem settled, a turnpike inevitable, a canal basin natural, a village ancient by habit. Yet beneath all such appearances there remained the earlier condition, when nearly every undertaking depended upon whether men and women could distinguish a sound tract from a deceptive one, a passable ford from a treacherous one, a promising meadow from an exhausted flat. Memory, if it wished to be honest, had to begin there, before the county acquired its courthouses and depots, when it was still a breadth of country asking to be interpreted rather than announced. The band remembered in county tradition as the first Dayton settlers had not arrived to inherit ease, and even in recollection, their number retained a kind of severity. Of the larger company once expected, only a smaller corps fulfilled the undertaking. Among them were the Van Cleves, the Newcombs, the Thompsons, the Hamers, the McClures, the Davises, the Goss family, John Dorough, William Chenoweth, James Morris, and Daniel Farrell. Their passage into the valley belonged to those years just before the county's legal creation, and their experience was repeated in varied fashion by later households in Washington, Miami, German, Wayne, Jefferson, and beyond. They came where timber stood thick, where clear title was not always simple, where roads were uncertain, and where the cabin had to precede comfort by a considerable interval. If the later county appeared composed, it was because these earlier families had endured its uncomposed state without extravagance of complaint. Their first labor was rarely singular. One did not simply build a house, or clear a field, or secure food. All these tasks existed at once and pressed one upon another. A cabin might go up with surprising speed, yet its walls had to be chinked, its hearth established, its puncheon floor smoothed, its roof tightened against weather. Trees were felled not only for the house, but for fencing, and fencing was required not only for crops, but for the maintenance of any order between household and wilderness. Corn went into the ground while stumps still stood. Wheat might be hoped for, though the land had scarcely been subdued enough to deserve hope. Hogs ranged where they could. A cow, if a family possessed one, altered the whole domestic economy. The women boiled, spun, mended, dried herbs, watched children, and made of each narrow space a place fit for continuation. Such labors, repeated in the shadow of uncertainty, constituted the true architecture of the county. In those first years, the very notion of neighborhood depended less on distance than on reliability. A family 3 miles away might be near if it kept a good horse, lent an auger, or arrived promptly when a roof was to be raised. A family 1 mile away might be distant if floodwater cut the bottom or illness entered the house. Thus, settlements formed not merely by location, but by habit of mutual assistance. Newcomb's Tavern in the early Dayton settlement acquired significance because it offered more than refreshment. It became a place of news, arrangement, and legal transaction. A mill seat along Mad River or Wolf Creek was valued not only for its wheel, but for the small exchange that grew around it. A meeting house, similarly, gathered more than worship. It gathered weather reports, road reports, marriage prospects, and the subdued but persistent commerce of acquaintance. Counties were often described by statute, but lived counties were made by recurrence. The trials remembered from pioneer recollection were not exaggerated by the mere fact of being old. Hard winters, summer ache, uncertain harvests, and the lingering danger of conflict or alarm belonged to the first stage of life in the valley. Men worked with rifles within reach. Women learned to store against failure. Children understood early that hunger had gradations and that comfort was a privilege to be renewed rather than presumed. Yet a curious gentleness remained in many descriptions of the period, as though endurance, when repeated long enough, shed complaint and entered habit. One might later speak of the first school in a blockhouse, or of Benjamin Van Cleve instructing children, or of a Sabbath gathering so small it scarcely deserved the name of congregation, and such recollections carried no bitterness. They carried instead the calm astonishment of people who had once possessed very little and still contrived succession. As the years advanced, households moved outward from the first river-centered nucleus into the wider frame of the county. Hamer's Hill, the lands toward Miamisburg, the German settlements around Twin Creek, the roads leading toward Centerville and Lebanon, and the northern tracts later thick with mills and Quaker farms, each received their share of this dispersed perseverance. A county seat might attract notice, but the county itself was always more than its seat. It was the sum of cabins becoming houses, houses becoming farms, farms becoming neighborhoods, and neighborhoods at last producing that mild authority which appeared in township meetings, tax duplicates, deeds, church records, and school accounts. To think of Montgomery County only as Dayton's background would be to miss how wide the human fabric had already become. A county's deepest speech was often agricultural, though it was spoken without hurry and seldom in words. In Montgomery County, the fields answered differently according to their position. The black bottoms by the rivers gave strength that seemed almost lavish, especially when first broken. The second bottoms and loamier stretches rewarded steadier management. The beach lands of the uplands carried their own promise, though they might hold moisture and require judgment. And the swampier northern ground, once ditched and drained, became surprisingly productive. Farmers learned not merely that land differed, but that each difference demanded a separate patience. One tract took wheat nobly, another answered better to corn, another, lying a little higher and warmer, suited tobacco or orchard trees. Much of the county's later abundance, admired by visitors and repeated in local histories, had rested upon this intimate, almost conversational relation between household and soil. The year turned not by calendar alone, but by task. In spring, there was ditch clearing, fence mending, seed sorting, the mending of harness, the testing of plow irons, and the anxious reading of late frosts. In summer, the county broadened into labor under light, hay cut in the meadows, corn hoed between rows, gardens weeded, flax or wool attended, smokehouses prepared, and stock watched near streams, grown low or troublesome by turns. Autumn gathered the county into smells of apples, shocked corn, fresh straw, cider, earth, and cooling leaves. Then winter brought milling, mending, spinning, schooling when possible, the trimming of orchard wood, and a long reckoning over what had been preserved. The quiet historian, if he desired truth, had to admit that the county was not built in court terms or election cycles nearly so much as in these returns of seasonal duty. Livestock, too, had their place in the county's order. Hogs belonged to the economy as naturally as wheat, for the valley's grain and mast alike sustained them, and pork entered both local consumption and trade. Cattle, though requiring more secure arrangement, altered household comfort in butter, milk, and manure. Horses gave not merely motion, but standing. Sheep supported woolen enterprise in those townships where carding and weaving later became important. The county histories, when they paused amid broader narratives, often allowed such things to appear by implication. A distillery near a mill, a tannery beside a branch, a drove road near a pike, a barn enlarged in later years, a woolen factory converted from earlier milling works. Behind each of these stood the husbandry of ordinary households, and behind that husbandry stood mornings begun before speech. Certain surnames entered the county's memory because they adhered to labor as faithfully as to lineage. The Hamers were recalled upon their hill. The Waymires appeared where mills and northern settlements drew activity. The Wengers were remembered in connection with farm, faith, and the woolen trade. The Hoovers and Younts entered the Stillwater country. The Fox family, the Swallows, the Sunderlands, and others appeared in the industrial margins of agrarian life, where saw, still, wheel, and field met one another. Such names were never most truthful when isolated in a recital. They became most real when seen at work. A child leading sheep to water, a preacher removing his coat after haying, a miller measuring grain while his sister counted skeins, a mother from one household borrowing yeast from another. Genealogy in the valley found its proper dignity not in display but in use. By the federal enumeration of 1,810, Montgomery County held about 7,722 inhabitants. By 1820, it had risen to about 15,999, and by 1830 to about 24,362. These figures, dry in appearance, were in truth agricultural statements as much as demographic ones. They indicated more stumps removed, more acres fenced, more mills set turning, more children baptized or schooled, more horses kept for road or market, more smoke rising from kitchens at dawn. By 1840, the number had reached about 31,938, and by 1850, records gave approximately 38,218, or 38,219, differing by a single soul, according to the table consulted. A variation small enough to seem almost emblematic of county life, where one individual, counted or missed, still belonged within the whole. Numbers thus entered the story not as abstractions, but as evidence that the land had accepted continued habitation. No county endured by bread alone, though bread remained essential. It also required forms by which its inhabitants interpreted one another, corrected one another, and bore disappointment with some degree of order. Among the first of these forms were worship and schooling. In Dayton, there was an early school in the blockhouse, and Benjamin Van Cleve was remembered as among the first schoolmasters. Such beginnings might appear humble in later retrospect, yet they announced a principle of permanence. A people uncertain of remaining did not construct instruction with care. A people uncertain of conscience did not raise meeting houses. Even the roughness of the first benches, the scantiness of books, and the imperfect glazing of windows testified to intention rather than deficiency. The room existed, the children gathered, the lesson proceeded, but that was often enough to begin a tradition. Religious life in Montgomery County took several forms, and its multiplicity gave the region a composed but varied moral texture. Methodists rode or walked to appointments and found hearers in cabins, groves, and modest frame houses. Baptists established congregations with grave simplicity. Lutheran and Reformed influences accompanied German settlement, especially where Twin Creek and related neighborhoods attracted families who desired both tillable land and familiar patterns of worship. In the northern and northwestern parts, friends from the Carolinas and elsewhere brought a quieter discipline, building meeting houses plain in aspect, yet durable in communal effect. The Mennonite and River Brethren currents, later visible around the Wenger household and associated circles, likewise entered the county not as noise, but as persistence. Religion in such a place was not always controversial in outward manner, but it was ceaselessly formative in custom, courtship, burial, Sabbath order, and the management of speech itself. Churches gave structure to time. The Sabbath, unlike market day, interrupted labor for reflection rather than exchange. Families set out earlier than necessary, children scrubbed and quieted, horses brushed, hymn books wrapped, and the road taken with a gravity distinct from weekday movement. There one heard not only sermons, but the county's softer intelligence, who had suffered fever, who had lost a child, who sought a hand for harvest, who had removed westward, whose orchard prospered, whose daughter was to marry, whose son had gone into trade at Dayton or Miamisburg. In this manner, worship houses became repositories of county feeling. The names later encountered in marriage registers, graveyards, donation lists, and church minutes were not names floating in air. They had once waited at doors in mud season, wiped boots upon thresholds, and listened while rain moved over shingles above them. Schooling beyond the first settlements spread in equally modest fashion. In Butler Township, the early schools near Polk Grove and Little York, and later brick replacements, belonged to a long county pattern in which instruction followed settlement with patient irregularity. A schoolhouse did not appear merely because children existed. It appeared when enough households believed that letters, figures, scripture, and discipline should be housed in common rather than passed entirely at the hearth. Thus, one room might hold children of several ages, one master, one stove, and an atmosphere alternating between diligence and weariness. Yet from such rooms came clerks, mill-keepers, merchants, preachers, and mothers capable of keeping accounts with precision. In a county moving from frontier uncertainty toward established agriculture and trade, the schoolhouse stood as one of the gentlest yet most decisive instruments of change. If one wished to trace the county's inward continuity, one could do worse than follow a single family from schoolroom to meeting house, and from meeting house to graveyard. There, a Van Cleve child might learn letters. There a Hamer or Davis household might hear Scripture. There a Waymeyer or Venger daughter might later wed. There a widow might be remembered in plain words. There the same surname might reappear, altered only by generation. Public records preserved the fact, but custom had preserved the life long before the clerk's hand intervened. In Montgomery County, memory thus resided not only in the courthouse, but in the path worn to church after rain, in the school bell heard across frosty fields, and in the long bench where families sat according to habits older than many laws. For a time, the rivers seemed sufficient, and indeed, no one could live in Montgomery County without regarding them as principal companions. The Great Miami, joined by the Mad River and fed by tributaries in all quarters, carried more than water in the county imagination. It carried possibility. Yet possibility on inland rivers was often interrupted by experience. Flood could render banks destructive. Drought could expose bars and hinder passage, and seasonal uncertainty made steady commerce difficult. Period recollections of Dayton spoke plainly of such frustrations. The river was useful, beautiful, and commanding, yet not always obedient. A county whose agricultural promise depended increasingly upon regular exchange could not remain wholly at the mercy of freshet and shallows. Thus the valley, while remaining faithful to its waters, began to seek something more deliberate than the river's temperament would reliably provide. The Miami Canal answered that desire for regularity. Begun in the 1820s and reaching Dayton with the first canal boats from Cincinnati in January of 1829, it altered not merely trade routes, but the county's sense of position. Dayton became a head of navigation for interior exchange, and farm products once constrained by road or stream entered broader circulation with greater confidence. Barrels, flour, pork, whiskey, timber, and manufactured goods alike now moved with a steadier rhythm. The canal did not erase the old county. It lay beside it, touched it, revised it. Basin, lock, towpath, warehouse, and stable entered the visual vocabulary of places already accustomed to barn, mill, and meeting house. Water remained central, yet it was water disciplined into civil use, made answerable to timetable, distance, and account. A canal town was not merely a place with boats. It was a place where waiting changed its character. Farmers from the surrounding townships who once had calculated chiefly by river depth or wagon endurance now calculated by basin schedules, storage space, and the relation between field and market. Miamisburg, Dayton, Alexanderville, West Carrollton, and connected points along the watery corridor acquired new shades of significance. The canal drew laborers, boatmen, merchants, carpenters, hostlers, and clerks into closer relation with farming households. It also brought sounds the older woods had never known in combination. Hoofs on packed towpath, boatmen calling low across water, lock gates striking timber, coopers hammering hoops, and the steady murmur of transaction in yards where produce changed hands with fewer uncertainties than before. It was fitting at such a midpoint in the county's recollection, to pause a moment and consider that those who listened in some distant chamber, upon a porch at the edge of evening, or while a road unspooled beneath a dim carriage of modern travel, belonged also to a geography of dwelling and passage. The old county households had once listened for mill wheels, rain upon shingles, and the slow step of horses returning at dusk. If one kept company with this channel of remembrance, one did something more than hear a narrative. One assisted in the quiet preservation of places whose substance had long depended upon being spoken of with patience. To remain with such recollection was, in its modest way, to keep faith with the continuity that linked one hearth to another across years and distances. The county's widening world did not abolish intimacy. Rather, it gave intimacy more avenues by which to sustain itself. Goods could move farther, letters could arrive more dependably, and younger men who entered trade or craft at Dayton still remained legible to the farm households from which they had sprung. By 1860, the county population had reached about 52,230, and by 1870, about 64,006, signs that Montgomery County had become not a remote agricultural pocket, but a region of connected communities. Yet the canal age, for all its utility, retained a softened countenance. The towpath progressed at animal pace. The basin reflected warehouse walls with untroubled clarity, and even commerce, when carried by canal boat, seemed to have accepted the law of deliberation. Such slowness suited the county, for it allowed growth without immediate frenzy. If the county's southern and central portions were shaped by confluence and canal, the northern and western reaches acquired much of their character through branch streams, mill races, and settlements that seemed modest until one counted how much labor passed through them. Butler Township, formed from earlier divisions and lying between the Miami and the Stillwater, had once included swampier land in its northern reaches, but drainage transformed much of it into strong agricultural ground. Water power, there was no poetic abstraction. It drove saws, stones, fulling apparatus, and the smaller manufactures that clustered wherever a branch could be tamed to service. The history of Little York and its vicinity made plain that mills had not been incidental. They had stood in strings, in successions, in conversions from one use to another, so that the same site might know, saw, grist, distilling, and wool in different years. Butler Township history. Little York, laid out near the mills associated with Andrew Waymeyer, and later remembered through the operations of Oliver Heck and others, belonged to that class of communities which grew not from ornament but from utility. Around such a place, one found grain wagons, meal sacks, wheel ruts, blacksmith work, gossip, and the measured impatience of men waiting their turn. Abijah O'Neill and Joseph Cooper had early connections with sawmill building there. The Yount interests, Benjamin Iddings, Robert Russell, George Huffman, John Hikes, Richard Sandham, John Wenger, John Mast, Joseph Staley, and Henry Waymeyer all appeared in connection with the local world of Branchwater enterprise. To recite the names was to suggest not celebrity, but continuity of management. Each name indicated hands at sluice, stone, gearing, or still, and behind those hands stood households whose domestic routine followed the wheel's demand. The Wenger household introduced another aspect of county life, wherein faith and industry stood close together. The elder, John Weaver Wenger, connected with the brethren by the river and later remembered in the local history of the brethren in Christ, occupied a position in which farm, mill, worship, and extended kinship converged. His son continued both ministry and manufacture, and the woolen concern associated with the family, later consumed by fire after years of use, remained emblematic of that county pattern, whereby a stream branch nourished at once bread, cloth, and religious neighborhood. Nearby names such as Good, Eby, Hare, Swank, and Lambert belonged not merely to church annals, but to the moving substance of rural life, where funerals, marriages, threshings, and doctrinal divisions occurred within a radius small enough to preserve mutual knowledge even when opinion diverged. Beyond Butler, other townships contributed their own variations. Randolph had its friends and its ordered rural gravity. Harrison, Jefferson, and Clay combined agriculture with villages and pikes. German Township, with settlements such as Germantown and associated places, held a distinctive linguistic and religious inheritance while becoming thoroughly rooted in local husbandry. In the county at large, mills did not merely process abundance. They created local centers of dependence. A mill could determine the direction of a road, the success of a store, the frequency of neighborly contact, and the site of a future school or chapel. Because grain had to move and wool had to be dressed, geography learned civility. Water that once rushed past sycamore roots now entered race and wheel and returned, after service, to its course. In these districts, one understood how thoroughly the county's quiet had been manufactured, not manufactured in the harsh sense of noise and smoke alone, but by steady contrivance. Drainage ditches had to be kept open, mill dams had to be watched after rains, wool had to be washed, carded, spun, dyed, and woven, meal had to be bolted. Timber had to be sawn into boards fit for barns, bridges, schools, and better dwellings. Thus, the seeming repose of a township evening, with cattle moving home and church bells faint beyond the branch, had behind it a long day of guided forces. Montgomery County's peace was rarely idleness. It was the appearance taken by labor when labor had become customary. No county could be understood solely through its seat, and Montgomery County offered several communities whose character was distinctive without being theatrical. Miamisburg, on the Miami River, carried early associations through Hull Station and later developed as a substantial town of river and canal relation. Its position gave it continuity, and its growth expressed that continuity in houses, trade, and a civic countenance, neither wholly rural nor entirely urban. Germantown, founded along Twin Creek, preserved the impress of German-speaking settlement in its church life, husbandry, and domestic order. Centerville, lying to the south and eastward of Dayton, gathered a quieter upland respectability. Vandalia, in the northern direction, and Chambersburg, along the Dayton and Troy route, served as useful reminders that village life in the county often arose where road, water, and neighborhood met with just enough force to become mutually sustaining. In Miamisburg and adjacent places such as Bridgeport and Alexanderville, one sensed a county consciousness shaped by movement along the Miami corridor. Here, ferrying, hauling, warehousing, and milling all had influence, while orchards and farms remained close at hand. A resident might hear at once the creak of wagons, the voices of boatmen, and the more domestic sounds of geese, churn, and supper bell. The town did not cease to be local when commerce increased. Rather, it became a place where the local was presented to the wider world in barrels, sacks, hides, flour, wool, and later manufactured articles. Its prosperity, where prosperity occurred, therefore bore a mixed complexion, partly agricultural, partly mercantile, and partly dependent upon transport systems whose condition could either favor or restrain the whole valley. Germantown and the surrounding German Township expressed another rhythm. There, fields, churches, language inheritances, and domestic customs retained a settled order that local historians repeatedly treated with respect. Barns appeared substantial, garden culture attentive, and worship plain but enduring. The names of Lehman, Studebaker, Flory, Fouts, Weaver, and Becher belonged to this world not merely as archival residue, but as tokens of households that had placed themselves deliberately in relation to Twin Creek, road, field, and chapel. The county's general character was thereby enriched, for the German element brought its own standards of thrift, building, and continuity. What appeared to an outsider as quietness might better have been called finish. Things were meant to last and were arranged accordingly. Other communities bore names that retained a touch of frontier oddity even after the county had matured. Stringtown, Swanktown, Brown's Chapel, College Hill, Arlington, Johnson Station, Tadmore, Farmersville, and New Lebanon each offered a different scale of settlement and a different relation to road or rail. Some grew from church crossings, some from mills or carriage shops, some from stations, some from pikes whose traffic was sufficient to support store and smithy. Their importance was not always proportional to size. A very small place might anchor a whole neighborhood's exchange and identity. It might contain the post office, the first reliable store, the school election, the accustomed doctor's route, and the nearest burying ground. Thus, the county was stitched together not by one city alone, but by many small knots of habitation, each holding a section of the fabric in place. By 1880, the county population had risen to about 78,000 550. Such a figure did not signify only Dayton's enlargement. It also suggested the ripening of these villages and the endurance of the townships that sustained them. Every increase implied more children at school, more pews filled, more wagons on pike or bridge, more cloth sold, more grain ground, and more names added to family Bibles. Yet even as numbers rose, each village retained a peculiar pace. Evening still settled upon Miamisburg with river softness. Twin Creek still moved past Germantown with its familiar sounds. Chambersburg still knew the approach of road traffic before it saw the dust. The county, though enlarged, had not entirely surrendered its ability to listen to itself. Roads had existed from the beginning, but early roads were often ambitions worn into the land rather than finished works imposed upon it. Daniel C. Cooper's first cut northward served necessity, and later traces followed usage as much as plan. In wet seasons, wheels sank. In dry seasons, dust rose. In winter, the road sometimes ceased to be a road, except by memory and fence line. Still, the county's increasing produce and traffic demanded improvement. By the 1830s, turnpike enterprise became more systematic, and routes such as the Dayton and Lebanon line, the roads toward Springfield and Troy, and related thoroughfares made the county more confidently traversable. Macadamized stretches altered not merely travel time, but social geography. A farmer who could reach market predictably lived in a different county, though the farm itself had not moved an inch. A pike gave villages reason to exist at intervals. Chambersburg on the Dayton and Troy route, Brown's Chapel at a crossing, Swanktown near the National Road and Salem Pike, and other such places were nourished by traffic that needed stopping points, blacksmiths, water, fodder, and conversation. The pike also brought itinerant commerce into deeper relation with settled husbandry. Peddlers, doctors, preachers, millwrights, and kin from other townships passed more regularly. News traveled by face and wheel. Courtship widened its radius. Farm women could obtain goods not produced at home with greater certainty, and craftsmen could carry finished work farther from the bench that made it. Distance did not disappear, but it softened. The county's breadth became more companionable. Then the railroads entered, and with them another revision of pace. Dayton, somewhat later than certain neighboring places in gaining full rail connection, was by the 1850s served by several lines, including the Dayton and Western, the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, the Greenville and Miami, and the Dayton and Union. Stations and shipping points in the county altered expectations once more. Johnson Station, Tadmore, and other rail-adjacent places entered the texture of local exchange. What canal had done with deliberation, rail now did with sharper efficiency. Produce reached markets sooner. Manufactured goods arrived in greater range, and the county's young men, tempted by opportunity, could pass more readily between township and town, town and city, city and distant connection. Yet the iron road, for all its power, did not wholly silence the wagon. The old, and the new endured side by side for a season, each correcting the other's claims. Rail brought other industries into stronger prominence. Papermaking, already significant in the county and early in Ohio, found larger pathways outward. Carriage work, agricultural implements, and related manufactures gained enlarged markets. West Carrollton, Dayton, and connected communities benefited in varying degree from this more rapid intercourse. Yet the county's industrial aspect remained inseparable from its agrarian foundation. The carload began in the field, the shop order in the barn, the factory payroll in the household economy that released sons or daughters toward wage labor. One could not honestly write county history as though rails created substance from nothing. They accelerated, diversified, and concentrated substance already present. As these changes proceeded, the map of the county became at once denser and more legible. Washington, Miami, German, Madison, Wayne, Jefferson, Butler, Harrison, Perry, Clay, Van Buren, Randolph, Mad River, and Jackson Townships no longer appeared as remote names in a clerk's schedule, but as interrelated districts through which roads and rails carried intention in every direction. A visit that once consumed nearly a day might be shortened. A market once doubtful might become customary. A village once peripheral might receive new consequence. Yet there remained, beneath all improvement, the old county law of weather, harvest, and water. Turnpike and rail refined the measure of distance, but they never abolished the dependence of all upon season and land. As the century advanced, Montgomery County entered a condition that might be called ripeness rather than novelty. The heroic inconveniences of the first settlement had softened, though they had not been forgotten. Fields were larger and more regular. Fences stood longer. Orchards cast a seasoned shade. Brick houses rose where log had once sufficed. Villages bore schools of better finish, churches of firmer architecture, and stores with broader stock. Yet the county's essential motions remained domestic. Women still governed pantries, dairies, linen presses, and family memory with a quiet authority seldom praised in public record. Men still measured much of their worth by land kept in order, debts honorably met, and barns weather-tight before winter. Children still learned county geography by chores before they learned it by map. Such continuities deserved notice precisely because they made change seem less violent than it was. Census numbers continued their calm testimony. From about 64,006 in 1870, the county moved to about 78,550 in 1880, and in the decade after, it would rise still further. Each increase suggested not only births and arrivals, but a more articulated economy. Dayton's pull strengthened. Market gardening, manufacturing, and specialized trade accompanied old grain and stock patterns. Villages such as West Carrollton and communities near the pikes or rails gained renewed importance. Still, one should be cautious of imagining that every household lived in progressive ease. Prosperity in county histories often appeared smoother on the page than in the kitchen or the account book. Rains failed, children sickened, mills burned, prices disappointed. Land inheritance complicated peace between siblings. Yet precisely because reverses endured, the county's composure, when it existed, had moral weight. It had been earned against interruption. The religious and educational fabric likewise deepened rather than vanished. Meeting houses were repaired or enlarged. Denominational distinctions persisted without wholly sundering neighborhood, and school systems became more regular in organization. In some places, older plainness remained. In others, a modest decorative confidence appeared in brickwork, windows, or interior fittings. The Quaker inheritance in northern districts still bore witness to restraint. The German churches still maintained their own continuity of speech and custom where possible. Methodist and Baptist congregations continued their familiar round. Brethren families, including those touched by the names Wenger, Good, Eby, Herr, and Swank, preserved a seriousness that shaped dress, marriage, and household rule. A county could modernize in outward mechanics and still remain ancient in conscience. Dayton itself, as county seat and growing center, increasingly gathered the county's energies without exhausting them. Farmers came in for trade, law, medicine, machinery, or schooling. Craftsmen moved in and out, with mixed identities, half urban and half rural. Daughters found service or purchase opportunities. Sons found apprenticeships, clerical positions, or factory employment. Yet upon evening return, the wagons still turned homeward toward Washington or Miami Township, toward Mad River or Jefferson, toward German or Clay, toward the branch roads of Perry and Jackson, and the quieter tracts of Randolph and Van Buren. This continued return mattered. It meant the county remained a place of residence rather than merely extraction. Dayton, however vigorous, still stood within Montgomery County rather than above it. At the close of a summer day in those later years, one might have stood upon a rise and seen what generations had wrought almost without proclamation. Here were fields patterned by long use, church spires set among trees, roads silvering in dust, mill ponds holding the last light, depots at rest, canals reflecting the sky, and houses in whose rooms family Bibles, deeds, school books, and folded garments all bore witness to continuity. The county had become dense with ordinary meaning. And ordinary meaning, because it seldom announced itself, was always in danger of being overlooked by those who sought only loud history. Yet if one listened properly, the low history was the more enduring. When one drew together the county's long impression, it did not resolve into a single monument. It resolved instead into an order of relationships. Water to meadow, meadow to field, field to mill, mill to village, village to pike, pike to canal, canal to rail, household to church, church to school, school to memory. This sequence, repeated across different townships and under different surnames, formed the county's true narrative line. Dayton and Miamisburg, Germantown and Centerville, Vandalia and Little York, Chambersburg and West Carrollton. Brown's Chapel and Stringtown all belonged to one another, not by likeness of size, but by exchange of use, obligation, and recollection. The county was thus less a collection of points than a woven country of dependencies, each modest in itself, each indispensable within the whole. The waters, in particular, persisted as the county's first and last companions. The great Miami held the main line. The Mad River came in with bright haste. The Stillwater touched the northern laboring world of mills and drained fields. Wolf Creek and Twin Creek served communities smaller in scale, yet deep in memory. And in the southeastern and eastern margins, the drainage toward the Little Miami system reminded all that watersheds, like counties, were larger than a single local loyalty. These streams had once been feared for flood, valued for fish, depended upon for power, and regarded for beauty. They had mirrored flatboats, ferry craft, canal works, bridges, and children leaning from banks with switches in hand. To remember the county without its waters would have been to remember a face without its expression. Its people, too, remained best remembered in relation rather than isolation. The Van Cleves, Newcombs, Hamers, Davises, Waymeyers, Wengers, Hoovers, Younts, and the many households of German, Quaker, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Reformed, and Brethren tradition were not marble names. They had handled meal scoops, hymn books, cradle straps, sheep shears, school slates, wagon tongues, orchard ladders, and burial shovels. They had watched weather with anxiety, watched children with tenderness, watched accounts with caution, and watched the county itself change without ever believing it would cease to demand steadiness from them. The dignity of such people did not require embellishment. It required only that their ordinary burdens be named without condescension and without haste. If one turned finally to the county's numbers, they formed a quiet ladder of habitation, about 78,550 by 1880. Yet the latter mattered chiefly because real lives stood upon its rungs. One child more at a school bench, one widow more in a township list, one mill hand more at the wheel, one preacher more on a circuit, one orchard more in bearing, one shop more at a crossroads. A county was never improved by arithmetic alone. It was improved, where it was improved at all, by the daily submission of appetite to duty and of loneliness to fellowship. Thus, Montgomery County, viewed with the composure it deserved, appeared not as a mere appendix to larger narratives, but as a completed world of its own scale. It had known frontier fear and later order, rough timber roads and turnpikes, uncertain river carriage and canal certainty, slow canal motion, and the sharper tempo of rail. It had held black bottoms, beachlands, upland farms, mill branches, village depots, brick schoolhouses, plain meeting houses, and the innumerable private rooms where the county's true endurance had been rehearsed by lamp and hearth. If some histories had preferred louder scenes, one might still return to this county for instruction in a subtler grandeur, the grandeur of continuance, of household discipline, of modest places faithfully inhabited, and of waters that remembered every bridge laid across them. And thus we close the entry for Montgomery County. Rest well.